In this lesson, we are going to learn about the early economy of South Carolina, which includes settlement and trade with the people of Barbados, the growing of cash crops, and the practice of mercantilism. Today, we're going to focus mainly on the natural resources in South Carolina. Now, the natural resources in South Carolina that would contribute to its economy were deer, who had fur that was a valuable commodity. We'll draw a quick, not too beautiful deer here. Another one was, and we've already talked about this, what was naval stores made out of? Remember naval stores, the pine sap? Yes. Pine trees, the pine forests. They were valuable not only for their lumber, but also for the sap from the pine trees. The mild climate was excellent for growing things, and unlike the New England colonies, there was a long growing season with really only 3 months, which are bad for growing things. Some additional things was, what was the first successful settlement in South Carolina? Yes, Charlestown. Well, Charlestown had some geographical features and climate features that was great for growing rice. So the geography of Charlestown was good for growing rice. Where did rice come from again? Did the English bring it over here? No. It was brought over here, and the knowledge came from the slaves. So the geography was good for rice planting. Charleston also had a port that was good for shipping. So it had a port and waterways that was good for shipping. We talked about how if you have ships, you can engage in trade, and that is one way to economically prosper in the times that we are talking about, the colonial times. So, continuing with the lesson, you can see some visuals for what we talked about. South Carolina had abundant resources that would contribute to its economy. Deer for skins and also the meat. Pine forests for harvesting the trees and naval stores. Fertile land and a mild climate, which resulted in a long growing season. The geographical conditions in the Low Country, which is the area surrounding Charlestown, was good for rice planting. The Charleston port and navigable waterways along the coast and into the interior made the shipping of goods to market possible. Here's a picture of a recreation of the Charleston port from the movie The Patriot, actually. Here are a few other visuals of the waterways in South Carolina. You can see the many rivers and streams. We have waterways around here, the Waccamaw River, the Petey River, and there's another picture of the Charleston port. The settlers of the Carolinas had a thriving fur trade with Native Americans until the settlers of the Carolinas tried to do this to the natives and force them into slavery. When they tried to force the natives into slavery, the natives became hostile and untrusting of the Carolina settlers, and this ends the fur trade in the Carolinas with the natives. Now, South Carolina, or the Carolinas, would have a thriving trade with the colony from which many South Carolinians came, and this thriving trade would be with where did the earliest South Carolinians as well as the first slaves to the Carolinas come from. Yes, it's from the tiny island of Barbados. We saw how small this island actually is. Well, this being more or less the mother colony of the Carolinas, it was a colony with which the Carolinas would establish trade. Carolina, having much larger areas of land, could establish things and grow things that they could not on Barbados. And one of these things that they traded with Barbados, and it makes a lot of sense that they would trade this, was this creature, which probably won't be beautiful. Yes, cattle. If you remember, slaves had advanced knowledge of how to tend cattle. And it makes sense that the people of Barbados would be interested in trading cattle because Barbados was tiny. Its actual size compared to South Carolina is probably about that big. Not much room for having cattle graze there. So this would definitely be something that they would want to trade with the Carolinas, cattle. And you can see why they do not have the opportunity to raise cattle on such a small area. They also traded slaves between the Carolinas, and Native American slaves were sent to Barbados. Now, a trade with Great Britain would also come from the Carolinas. We talked about how the British had pretty much cut down all their trees. However, they still have the most powerful navy in the world, and they need supplies to maintain that navy. And one of the things they needed was the naval stores that could be harvested from the Carolina pine trees. So, naval stores trade was a profitable exercise with Great Britain. So, the people of the Carolinas traded cattle and slaves with the people of Barbados, naval stores with Great Britain, and also its ultimate crop, rice. The trade of rice would be one of the most profitable things that planters in the Carolinas could do. Once again, this knowledge of rice came from African American slaves, but it would make those planters who could grow it in the Low Country enormous amounts of wealth. It brought such long-term prosperity to the Carolinas that it was viewed as almost the gold of the Carolinas. And because it was viewed as the gold of the Carolinas, it received the nickname Carolina Gold. You can still see a brand of rice today that's named Carolina Gold. So the natural resources made for a flourishing trade in the Carolinas. The Carolinas became a profitable colony. The fur trade that had begun, though, ended because the South Carolina forced the natives into slavery, which ended the good relationship with them. Early Carolina settlers came from Barbados and established a thriving trade with this colony where they traded both cattle and slaves. The commodity that the Barbados was growing, I'm not sure, but I'm sure Barbados had something that the Carolinas could not necessarily produce because Barbados was way more tropical than the Carolinas. Once again, Carolinians sold cattle and slaves to the people of Barbados. A main export to Great Britain was the pitch and tar, or naval stores, which Britain needed to make their ships watertight. Not only their enormous and powerful navy, but also their merchant ships. So naval stores were an essential commodity for boats. Not only for the boats, but also barrels of things that would ship things on boats. So, picture of an old wooden ship that would require naval stores, which came from pine trees. Once again, the growing slave trade brought laborers and their knowledge of herding cattle, but more importantly, rice planting, which the British had no idea how to do, to the Carolinas. This earns rice in South Carolina the nickname Carolina Gold, and it became a staple crop and source of long-term prosperity. Sometime after the beginning of the Carolinas, there was an enterprising young lady who could not grow rice on her land and join in its long-term prosperity. And she was a bit of a botanist and did some experiments with another desirable plant. This desirable plant is called indigo. Now, indigo is a plant that's used to make a highly valued blue dye. Now, previous strains of indigo that were grown would offer the blue dye. However, if you wore it in hot climates and sweated or it rained, you would end up with the blue dye on your skin. This enterprising young lady, who's named Eliza Lucas Pinckney, figured out how to grow a better strain of indigo, which would not result in the person wearing it turning bluish purple. Now, the British government realized the value of this indigo and that the demand for it worldwide would be substantial. So, in order to encourage people to grow this indigo in the Carolinas, they started to offer extra payments. They said, South Carolina planters, if you can't grow rice, grow indigo. Because grow it and we will pay you extra money for growing this crop. This extra payments for growing indigo, or any extra payment for growing anything, is called a bounty or a subsidy. So Britain offered this bounty or subsidy for the growing of indigo because they realized that an improved version of this would be a very valuable commodity to the world. Here is a much better picture of Eliza Lucas Pinckney and the indigo plant that she was growing, because here's a picture in color. But this indigo, this new strain of indigo that Eliza Lucas Pinckney mastered, would help make her family's plantation successful and would cause the British to offer a subsidy as an incentive to anyone who would grow it. Now, due to the success of these cash crops, both rice and indigo, the slave trade grew from Africa, and there's an increase in the number of slaves in the Carolinas. Once again, the success of growing both rice and indigo, and even harvesting naval stores, this causes the slave trade to grow in Carolina. So cash crops causes the slave trade to grow because a labor source is needed to harvest these cash crops. Now, we're going to end the lesson with the economic system of the day. The economic system of the day was mercantilism. I know last year you learned about mercantilism and the whole reason that mother countries develop colonies. Mother countries develop colonies because they want to become wealthy and powerful. Mercantilism is the regulation of trade for the benefit of the mother country. Who was the mother country for the Carolinas? Yes, it was England, or it was part of the British Empire. So England or Britain is a decent answer. Now, the system of trade under mercantilism in Carolina might look like this. One of the natural resources in Carolina was its lumber. Well, under mercantilism, South Carolina may have been required to send all of the lumber they harvest to Great Britain. So any lumber that you harvest goes to Britain, to England. And what happens with that lumber is the British furniture shops would use this lumber to make furniture, like chairs. That's a bad one, but you get the point. Tables, maybe desks. And they would sell this to the British people, but they would also do this. They would ship back to the Carolinas these finished manufactured goods. Now, the ironic thing is, these tables and chairs were made with wood from what colony? Yes, they came from the Carolinas. And now they're selling them back manufactured goods that were made with their own lumber. Now this is using your colonies for two things. One, the colonies are used as a source of raw materials. There were many items in South Carolina that they absolutely had to ship directly to Britain. But it's not only using your colonies as a source of raw materials, but you're also using your colonies to buy these manufactured goods from manufacturers in the mother country. Now, a place where you buy things is called what? It starts with an M. Yes, it's called a market. So, under mercantilism, South Carolina served as both a source of raw materials and a market for British manufactured goods. This would be the model for mercantilism everywhere, where the colonies were more or less taken advantage of. And you may ask, well, why don't they just make their own chairs here? There's a real easy answer. They were prohibited from having manufacturing such as this in South Carolina or in the Carolinas. We'll talk more about mercantilism tomorrow. I would like to see more of what you know from your previous lessons. And then we will talk about how South Carolina controlled the trade of both rice and indigo to ultimately benefit England. England controlled the trade of rice and indigo to most benefit them and make their country, their mother country, wealthy and powerful. Until then, thank you for listening. I hope you did well.